Okay, we're here with IdrA. We're at ESWC, but when everyone hears this, it's going to be past ESWC. How are you doing?
Pretty good. I just played my first match. It was against a Japanese player, so, you know, not that big of a deal, but I won.
Okay. The first thing I wanted to ask you about actually was, obviously over the last few months, there was this big promotional push from EG because you bring in a HuK on board, and obviously with Monster and all this, I've heard it's like a big step up for EG, like lots of sponsorships being pumped into things, and StarCraft 2 is like obviously the main focus of the team now. They played it up in the promotional stuff about you versus HuK and this big rivalry thing. How much was it really like a rivalry of like dislike before for you with HuK when he was in like other teams?
We never disliked each other personally. We always got along pretty well. We have a really similar sense of humor actually. We're pretty good friends even before he joined EG. But I just didn't respect his play very much and kind of said so. But he's improved a lot. Obviously he's been practicing really hard in Korea for a long time. So yeah, there's no friction at all there anymore.
I mean, that's actually the next thing I wanted to bring up, is that even though it was perceived that you were kind of saying mean things about him in interviews, etc., I never actually saw you say anything about him personally. You tended to say stuff about Protoss, or you said about his style of play. What was it about his style of play in the past? Was it like too abusive? What did you think?
It's very, very risky. There's still elements of risk, but he's just gotten better at reading the gameplay and like figuring out when to pull his back, his 3-century pushes, stuff like that. But no, he just played really risky, and he's gotten a little bit more reliable.
Do you think it helps your game having him to practice against when you're going to have this set up soon?
If we could practice together, it would obviously help. But he lives in Korea, and we both hate crossover play. So for now, we're not able to practice together. But once I go out to Korea, it'll help a lot.
Okay. What is your overall feeling at the moment about Zerg versus Protoss? Because you've been one of the most like vocal people, even when sort of buffs have been made to slight stuff for Zerg. You've still been kind of saying like it's not enough. Like it's certain areas of the game where it's still it's too much that the Zerg can't do rather than the Protoss can do early on. How do you feel about that overall?
I think it's still a bad matchup, not necessarily imbalanced, but the best way for Zerg to win is various timings in the early mid game. You see a lot of Korean Zergs just completely focused on busting the Protoss third if they try and take it. And if Protoss plays absolutely perfectly and figures out what the Zerg is trying to do, then they can absolutely stop that. And I think if it goes to a late game death ball, then Protoss should win if they just turtle up and do Warp Prism Brass. But a lot of Protoss were just used to their Colossus Stalker A move, so they sit there and they don't make Warp Prisms and they bitch about it. So they think that Infestor Broodlord is still overpowered in the late game when it's not. Turtle and Warp Prism with a Mothership beats it pretty easily. So I think Zerg can win, but Zerg doesn't have a reliable way to always beat a player worse than them, which I find personally frustrating. And I think it's a poorly designed matchup because of that. So while the statistics may be balanced now, I think as Protosses get better, it will go Protoss favor in terms of the numbers. And I think it's just a bad matchup in general, not fun to watch.
I mean, I've noticed in terms of imbalance, a lot of people seem to be, they kind of use like a really simplistic model for whether they think a race is unbalanced, where they just look like, is this player winning tournaments? And if he's a Zerg, then Zerg must be okay, and if it's a Protoss. So I mean, people would say at the moment, probably, oh well, if Protoss is such a favourite in that matchup, then how come there's so few Protoss in GSL Code S, etc.? Do you think it's more that Protoss is getting bashed themselves by the Terrans? What do you think it is?
I think specifically in GSL, it is more because of PvT. Obviously, I don't play the matchup, so take it with a grain of salt, but PvT seems really Terran favored to me right now. The threat and the strength of the 1-1-1, and then just Cloak Ghost late game plus Vikings and Scan, obviously, just seems pretty silly to me. It seems like Terran is really strongly favored in that matchup, and the results in GSL certainly favor that. And you get all the Protosses knocked out, obviously they're not going to be beating the Zergs anyway, so I think that definitely plays a factor in those statistics specifically.
Thinking of the mindset of Blizzard themselves, do you get an uneasy feeling that like Terran's probably never going to be nerfed enough? Like it seems as though whenever they have a new unit or they're announcing new things, there's always some little thing that actually improves things for Terran in some way.
I don't really understand that, but a lot of the thing is that Terran, even from the start, had so many different options. They just have so many more units with a lot of different.
And they seem to be adding more as well to Terran.
To some extent, but they've always had a lot of utility that Terran players didn't really take advantage of because they didn't need to. So every time that Terran got a legitimate nerf, it just pushed them on to figure something else out. Like all their early game cheeses got nerfed early on, and they were like, oh, this is going to be terrible now. We're not going to be able to macro with Zerg and Protoss. And then they find out they can make 3 orbitals and keep up in macro just fine. So Terran is just the least developed race, or it has been. And I think as we keep going and they keep nerfing them, eventually we may hit some sort of balance, but I think it's just the design of the Terran race that makes them a lot harder to balance. But I don't really have much faith in Blizzard in terms of anything, so I wouldn't count on it.
Okay. Since you played Brood War, in Brood War people famously used to say, oh, the game's very balanced, it works out very well, because you could statistically even look at the numbers and they were fairly close for all the matchups. Do you think it is the case that a game can ever actually be truly balanced, or do you think it's more like, I mean, my take on Brood War was more with that it wasn't necessarily balanced in every area, it's just that like overall somehow things worked out to make it sort of even out, like one player got his strength here, but later on they might have a strength if they can get at this point of the game. Do you think it's more like that? Is it possible to ever actually have every race be equally in all three matchups?
People kind of blow StarCraft 1 balance out of proportion, just like rose-tinted glasses. Zerg always beat Protoss a little bit more, Terran always lost to Protoss a little bit more, Terran always beat Zerg a little bit more, you know, and obviously that would fluctuate. And it was very close to balance. The closest RTS to balance, as far as I know, that's sort of been played competitively. But now getting everything perfect in a game with three truly distinct races, I don't think that's really going to happen. But there's always going to be fluctuations in the meta game, and players obviously play a huge role in it. I think it's possible to get balanced enough that it essentially doesn't matter. I don't know if we'll get that with StarCraft 2 though.
So do you think in terms of Brood War, the balance actually was just kind of like fortune, like happenstance? Because I mean, you could say if you looked at when Blizzard stopped doing the patches, a lot of the things that evened it out were like gameplay changes that people could have never seen, like muta stacking or PvZ, these sorts of things you couldn't really have foreseen. I think it's just coincidence.
Muta stacking was a bug in the game, and without it, ZBT would be pretty unwinnable in modern Brood War, and that was something that wasn't supposed to be in the game. I think Blizzard got really lucky with that. And another thing is, there was just so much room for skill in Brood War, it was just so hard to actually execute the game, that there was so much room to be good at it, or to be bad at it, that allowed player skill to compensate for balance in a lot of different scenarios. And in StarCraft 2, that just kind of doesn't exist, so that's another thing that will make it much harder with this game.
That's something I wanted to ask you actually, is because if you think of the mindset of Blizzard in StarCraft 2 now is like, okay, Blizzard will change the game for us, they'll fix this, they'll tweak that for the competitive game. But like you were saying there, I mean, you could actually make the case that part of what allowed Brood War to be really competitive and so good for so many years is that the game was actually quite limited in terms of like, you couldn't do everything in one go, etc. So for example, the Dragoons, you couldn't just move a whole unit of Dragoons, or a whole group, otherwise it's going to be fuck up, you know. So it means that the APM has to be better, your micro has to be better. Like you were saying about the muta stacking, all these things that essentially were like, they hadn't developed the game to a certain degree in one direction, and so the players could sort of figure out little tricks that took it forwards. Is that even possible in the modern day of game development, do you think?
It certainly is. We've had stuff like that pop up in StarCraft 2.
Give me an example.
The void ray phasing thing, where they could like shoot each other and maintain the charge or whatever. But then Blizzard took it out because they.
Do you think those kinds of things need more time to like test if it is really imbalanced and whatnot before you take it out?
Yeah, certainly. Anything that requires that much skill. Well, actually, I don't know how hard it was to do, but anything that adds skill to the game should certainly be allowed to have its place if it possibly can, because that only makes the game better.
Okay. Actually, I wanted to talk about Brood War for a while now. So you had this period where you were living in Korea. You were practicing with it was IdrA, wasn't it?
IdrA, then CJ.
CJ after IdrA. Okay. So you were actually in a team house. You were one of the few people who got the chance to like every day you could practice with coaches and whatnot. If people want to have the knock on StarCraft 2, the first thing people said, I mean, there was that famous article about it, was all the people who were the top of StarCraft 2 now weren't so good in Brood War, so, you know, if the Brood War players came over, they'd dominate everyone. I mean, you could add on to that people probably thought, well, if IdrA was practicing every day, all day long, and he was only on the CJB team, and he wasn't actually playing in Pro League, and he's one of the best StarCraft 2 players now, so is that a knock against StarCraft 2? So on that level, I wanted to ask you, do you feel like the level you were at in Brood War when you left, that you were like a certain amount of trajectory away from actually getting onto like the A team, getting into Pro League matches, getting into individual leagues? Was it something you foresaw like in the near future?
Potentially, yeah. I had been in CJ for a little bit over a year, I think, when StarCraft 2 came out. Maybe I have the times wrong. But it generally takes a player about a year on an average team to get their first Pro League appearance. And CJ was obviously one of the top tier teams with a really, really deep lineup, so it took longer for them. so I was still kind of a developing player at that point. And another thing is there's a lot of different factors there, like I couldn't speak Korean, so I was a little bit handicapped by that. But then we switch over to StarCraft 2 where the Koreans don't have the head start. Not speaking Korean doesn't hinder you as much, so that removes that handicap that I had. And another thing is that article that you referenced was actually pretty limited, biased. Like he painted things in a certain light because he had something to say. A lot of the players who are now on top, like MC and MVP and stuff, they were recognized as really, really good players in practice. They just hadn't really shown it on TV yet.
Yeah.
But like MC, he went 1-10 or something in Pro League, but they kept sending him out because he was really good in practice and they wanted him to get that exposure. And then he comes over to StarCraft 2, and it's a different stage. He knows he's the best. That removes a lot of the nerves. It gives you a lot of confidence, and that talent starts to show through.
So it was like a similar thing then. All these players could have been good in Brood War, they just didn't necessarily get the chance to manifest it.
Some of them. It is certainly easier. If Flash and J-Dog switched over and practiced seriously, they would 100% be on top. But to say that StarCraft 2 has no talented players, that's definitely an overstatement.
With all that said, I mean, obviously you're a professional StarCraft 2 player. To some degree, you have to like the game, you have to want the game to grow and continue, etc. But as someone who played Brood War for so long, I mean, I'm sure you'd be one of the first people to admit it's clearly like there's more skill involved in the game. It's probably unlikely ST2 can get to the same level of like how amazing to a player like a Flash or a Bisu can be now at this level. Is this fair to say?
Oh yeah, I've been one of the biggest critics of StarCraft 2. I think StarCraft 1 was a much better game.
So, I mean, obviously for you, all the benefits are in playing StarCraft 2, because like we were saying before, it was almost impossible to break into that top tier in Korea, not speaking Korean. But at the same time, is that part of what frustrates you about playing StarCraft 2 now? The fact that you can see that in StarCraft, in Brood War for example, if you're at a certain level, then you know like, okay, it's very unlikely this guy below me can beat me no matter what, so there was a certain satisfaction to being that good in that game.
Yeah, absolutely. That is my biggest frustration with StarCraft 2. It's just so easy for inferior players to win games. It's pretty terrible. Not only is it frustrating, but it's also pretty bad for esports. You need to have repeat winners that you can get behind. Talent needs to pay off, and it does, obviously, to a bigger extent than probably any other RTS in StarCraft 1, but not nearly as much as StarCraft 1. And there's a reason that StarCraft had the kind of success it did in Korea. And I think StarCraft 2 should try to emulate that, but it won't, and that's just kind of something we have to deal with. It sucks.
So I mean, along those lines, everyone who likes StarCraft 2 now seems to be on this mindset of like, they actually really want Flash to come over, they want J-Dog to come over, because they have it in their mind like, oh, if they're so good at Brood War, then they're going to get to a similar level in StarCraft 2. But I mean, is it fair to say it probably isn't even possible to be that good of that? If you're the #1 guy in Brood War, you could actually be beating the #2 guy all the time, like Flash was to J-Dog towards the end there. But I mean, if you looked at GSL, you'd probably say that it's almost impossible to win like back-to-back GSLs.
Well, MVP is about to do it, so it's not really impossible. And MVP is actually enough better than everyone else, plus he's Terran, which gives it's a little bit more easy to be like standard, reliable, or consistent with Terran. So, right now, because the game is relatively young, it's not impossible to have that level of dominance. But yeah, as it matures and as we get more and more talented players switching over to StarCraft 1, I would say it's going to be really hard to have like a repeat champion or anything like that.
Well, bearing in mind, StarCraft 2 is doing fine as it is. It's got so many players, so many tournaments. Do you, as a fan of Brood War, as somebody who liked that game, would you actually prefer that people like Bisu, etc., if they want to play Brood War, did stay over in Brood War and played that game? Would it be better to have them show their talents off in that game and then the StarCraft 2 players play their game? Or do you think everyone should merge into one and see who's the best?
There's a bunch of different ways to look for it. Professionally, it would make the scene harder for me, but if big names like that switched over, it would bring a lot more attention to StarCraft 2, which would also benefit me. So I'm not sure which would be better professionally. And from a spectator point of view, obviously I want to keep seeing Flash and J-Dog play StarCraft 1 just because it is so amazing what they can do with that game. And I don't think they can really emulate that in StarCraft 2. So yeah, purely selfishly, I'd like to see that. But I think it would be good for esports if everyone kind of switched over to StarCraft 2 and made that the go-to game.